for her for a moment. So it's my pleasure to introduce Ezequiel Morsella, who was at NCC, this Northern California Conscious Meeting a couple of years ago, and shared with us parts of his passive frame theory, which was really provocative and interesting. So Ezequiel comes to us from UCSF and San Francisco State, and his title is Passive Frame Theory, a New Synthesis. So let's welcome Ezequiel.
Thank you very much. It is an honor to be here. I am very grateful to Professor Isham, Professor Luck, and Lara Christ for being here. It is a great honor and a delight to be part of this distinguished panel of speakers. Today I'll be talking about passive frame theory, which is a synthesis of at least 5 hypotheses and theories about consciousness, and it's an action-based approach. And I'm not going to be able in 20 minutes to cover the evidence for each of the 5 theories that are synthesized in this new framework. I'm just going to review the assumptions of the framework, the theories that were synthesized, and then by putting these theories together, one reaches new counterintuitive conclusions about the nature of consciousness. So I'll mention those insights in the latter part of the talk. If you're interested in the theory, it is a Target article in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, and I have copies up here for you, which you can take. I haven't gotten reprints yet, so these are just manuscript copies. But when I send them to people, they say it's too much ink, it's too long. So I printed them out for you so you can take a copy. And also, if you read it, and you can email me, I can send you the reply to the 30 Target articles that were written in response to this Target article. Some people like the reply more than the Target, so I can send you that by email. Okay, so there's the article if you need it, if you're interested in having it. Passive frame theory is unique in several ways. It's a synthesis of various theories from different fields of studies. It's a descriptive approach to consciousness. It speaks about the products of evolution as they are and not as they should be. So it's not looking at optimal design. So it's a descriptive approach. And from descriptive approach, locomotion was achieved in humans in a very different way than it was achieved in artificial systems, right? Wheels versus legs. And the artificial heart is very different from the natural heart. And engineers say we would never design it as the artificial heart. So this is a descriptive reverse engineering approach to the brain. When one adopts this descriptive approach, one reaches an inevitable contrast, and that is the contrast between conscious and unconscious processes in the brain. So from a descriptive approach to the brain, one cannot help but encounter this distinction, and this distinction has been described by different terms in different subfields of studies, but it exists in all subfields of studies. So you have implicit versus explicit, controlled versus automatic. In psychophysics, you have supraliminal versus subliminal. So in every field of inquiry in neuroscience and psychology, the distinction has been made between conscious and unconscious, though many times the term conscious is not used. Someone said to me, Ezequiel, I don't study consciousness, I study perceptual awareness. So this contrast reveals that consciousness serves a circumscribed role that involves only a subset of all of the regions in the nervous system, as was mentioned earlier today. What is unique about the approach is that it's based on olfaction instead of vision. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into the olfaction data. And it's based on action instead of on perception. So it's a descriptive approach that looks at these things. And I'm not going to cover the neurological literature, but the theory is based in large part on the neurological literature concerning the neural correlates of olfactory consciousness. The other reason why the approach is novel is that we look at the lowest, simplest implementations of behavior that involve consciousness. So we have a hypothetical creature that we think about that is conscious, but does not have things like symbol manipulation or indirect cognitive control in which one thinks of food to make oneself hungry. So all of these things that adult humans tend to do, we're just ignoring them for now and looking at the most basic cases. One of the replies to the Target article, one of the commentaries, they stated, your hypothetical organism exists. It's called a young child that doesn't yet use phonological loop and indirect cognitive control. So we're looking at the most simple cases. So the framework and architecture portrayed is a synthesis of 5 theories, And it's based in large part on the research by Bjorn Merker, which is also an action-based approach toward consciousness. So here are here are some of the theories that are synthesized in this mega theory, idiomotor theory. So this is most based on Jamesian idiomotor theory, which is similar to Lutz's idiomotor theory. Now, idiomotor theory, the idea is that the conscious percept of an action effect, for example, the image of a word or a sniff, directly activates to some extent the unconscious motor programs that would lead to that action effect. So idiomotor theory has this element in it, and so do continuous flow models, which are used to explain the effects of distractors in the flanker task and in the Stroop task, and so do cascade PDP models. It's also married to the sensorium hypothesis, in which of all aspects of action control, one is only conscious of the perceptual consequences of action and is unconscious of the efference or efference generation process. So when one sniffs like this, the action is perceived to take place here, and one is unconscious of the efferences to the intercostal muscles and diaphragms. And this goes back to Jamesian theory. So motor control itself is unconscious. One is conscious of the perceptual aspects of action. And idiomotor theory, cascade theories, and continuous flow models say that these perceptual representations of action consequences, when activated, will stimulate the unconscious efference generators that would lead to the expression of that action. The other aspect of the theory is parallel responses into skeletal muscle, which states that there are many integrations in the nervous system that occur unconsciously. For example, intersensory conflicts, as in the McGurk effect or ventriloquism, are resolved unconsciously. So intersensory integrations and conflicts are resolved unconsciously. Conflicts involving motor control, as the work of David Rosenman shows, are also resolved unconsciously. Conflicts involving smooth muscle effectors, as in the pupillary reflex or peristalsis, are also resolved unconsciously. Those integrations and conflicts are resolved unconsciously. Conflicts involving action selection, in specifically action selection for the skeletal muscle effector system, those are consciously mediated, and that's when you feel urges, and that's when you are aware of the conflicting tendencies. So intrapsychic conflicts are never about what is it? Is it a red apple or a green apple? Intrapsychic conflicts in the Neil Miller tradition or in the Freudian tradition always involve action selection. The last mega big piece, and there are 4 other ones that are put into this framework, is encapsulation. Encapsulation is that the vast majority of conscious contents are generated unintentionally, and they just quote unquote happen to you. You open your eyes, you see the red apple. You open your eyes, you have an urge. And in a creature without indirect cognitive control and without all of these complicated processes that adult humans show, most contents, even in us, occur in this manner. Encapsulation is that knowledge or your desires cannot modulate or affect the generation of these conscious contents that occupy the conscious field, which is everything you're conscious of at one moment in time. So the PRISM principle is that parallel responses to the skeletal muscle is the kind of situation for which conscious mediation is necessary. Conflicts occurring at perceptual stages of processing, motor control stages of processing, and we incidentally have arrived at ideas that are very similar to the famous psychological refractory period bottleneck, which involves action selection. So, importantly, when you put all of these hypotheses together, and it's a bit of a Rubik's Cube, the thing you get is internally coherent and explains everything about consciousness except what Mark called the implementation level of analysis, that is, how neurons instantiate these states. However, the framework does provide clues regarding the hard problem of consciousness, of how neurons instantiate these states. Those clues are more in the reply to the commentaries than in the target article. So I could email that to you if you're interested. So here are the main conclusions. The main conclusion that results from the synthesis is that, in short, consciousness is for what in everyday life is called voluntary action. The term voluntary is not a scientific term, it's homuncular. But in everyday life, conscious mediation is necessary for that kind of action that we colloquially describe as voluntary. More specifically, it's a kind of action called integrated action, such as holding your breath while underwater, where you have multiple inclinations. You want to inhale, but you don't because you're underwater. You're carrying a hot dish of food to the dinner table, you want to drop it, but you don't because it's expensive china. So when behavior becomes unconscious, you don't have a lack of action. You have a lack of integrated action. So you just drop the hot dish of food. While underwater and holding your breath, if, forbid, you become unconscious, you don't sit there in actionless stupor. You actually perform the complex act of inhaling. These are unintegrated actions. When you see unintegrated actions in neurological conditions, they look like they're not influenced by all the kinds of information by which they should be influenced. And that is furnished normally by the conscious field. So the conscious field is for voluntary action selection right now. So from this we learned that the role of consciousness is very circumscribed. It involves only a subset of brain regions which are discussed in the paper. And it's a system that's devoted fully to the skeletal muscle output system, which serves the somatic nervous system. Which is interesting because the other nervous system is called autonomic, which means that you don't control it. So it makes sense. Now that you don't control it is not a very scientific term because it's homuncular, correct? But it all makes sense that it would be with the somatic nervous system. Conflicts involving smooth muscle, pre-action selection conflicts, and actually what we're learning now is action selection itself is post-conscious. Consciousness is about the options for action selection. And they have to be put in a certain format, and that's what consciousness provides. Action selection, the battle of what to do in the Stroop task or in the flanker are post-conscious. All right. So the evidence for the framework stems from the evidence of the many theories synthesized within it. Some of this evidence comes from our own lab, so we've contributed to all of the different kinds of theory. We have data on all of those things. And a lot of the evidence recently comes from our new paradigm, the reflexive imagery task, where we're learning that the generation of high-level contents, phenomenologically, is very similar to the generation of low-level contents. And the framework explains why that should be. So, the primary function of consciousness is to integrate otherwise encapsulated outputs in the service of action selection at one moment. Each of these outputs themselves may be polysensory in origin. So the McGurk effect, DA, that you get from the intersensory processing, you just get for free. Consciousness is not for the McGurk mediation. You get the DA. The consciousness would be, you're doing the McGurk effect in an experiment, you smell smoke, and you say, I'm leaving this experiment. Okay? So it's that level of action selection. Each of the products composing the field can be generated by polysensory unconscious processes. Now, what's really interesting is that most of the properties of the conscious field, so your sense or feeling of one person apprehending the field, whether in a dream or while awake, that sense arises from the demands of action selection. This is not something I say, Merker says it as well. You perceive this object on your left and this object on your right because it would be disadvantageous for you to treat an object on your right as if it were on your left. And insofar as space is used in decision making about what to do, that bushel of hay is further than that one, then everything has to be mapped in such a way that it seems as if your conscious field is looked at from an egocentric first-person perspective. So many of the properties of the conscious field, and what's interesting in what Hume noted was that if you look for the self that's looking at the field, there's nothing there, which is scary. So there's this, everything looks as if from a first-person perspective, and that would be required for adaptive action selection. So most of the properties of the conscious field, including the first-person perspective and the notion of a homunculus staring at the field, arise from the requirements of adaptive action selection. The constraints of adaptive action selection right now are making the field look that way. And so you may have a little dream snippet in hypnagogic sleep where you think that you're a chef. I have dreams where I'm someone else all the time. So last night I had a dream where I was a chef and I was telling someone, where are the cucumbers, and I woke up. Well, at that moment, thankfully, my dreams are all like that. Where's table 2? We have to send, where's table 2? There's an appendix to this paper. Okay, so, but the whole point of the field is at that moment, that element of action selection, which itself is actually post-conscious. So unlike other approaches, passive frame theory specifies which integrations require consciousness and which do not, which is a current and major problem. It also explains subjective data from intersensory conflicts, which are unconscious, smooth muscle conflicts, which are unconscious, synchrony blindness, which is peculiar, when two mechanisms lead to the same action plan, one is unaware that two mechanisms are at play. When two mechanisms are in conflict, one says, I have urges. The theory also explains, and this is what the neurologists like, why skeletal muscle has historically been called voluntary muscle, why it's the only voluntary effector. Also, why one is aware of conscious contents even though they're not relevant for ongoing action or for other contents comprising the field. The field is very dumb. Each content not only does not know about the other contents, it should not know. And we'll speak more about this. So, the synthesis leads to several counterintuitive insights. This you get by marrying all the 5 frameworks, and I can't go over the evidence for each framework, but some of these are pretty counterintuitive. Conscious contents and the field influence only action systems, which themselves are unconscious, and not content generators. So the contents are generated, they're put in the field by systems that are devoted to that. The field is apprehended by multiple, not one homunculus, multiple action systems that are sampling it, and each of them is unconscious. This is called unidirectional communication in robotic systems. Conscious contents cannot influence each other at the same time. That would violate encapsulation and would be bad. If you could at will turn off the feelings of nausea or pain or of guilt, then these states would no longer serve their adaptive purpose. So that is why you are conscious of many things that you are not directly conflicted about or acting about. And this is why when you're running across the hot desert sand for water, the tissue damage on the feet still feels bad, although the action will save your life. You go to the doctor and you get an injection, the injection will save your life. There's still a system protesting saying tissue damage, tissue damage. It doesn't know that you're at the doctor and all of these other things, and it should not know. Once you have that across-system contamination, then the field can no longer work adaptively. So what we've realized is conscious inclinations are behaviorally suppressible. You let the doctor do it. The urges are not suppressible. So the behaviorist had it wrong. The SR link is not about behavior. The SR link is about the content in the field. You can suppress the behavior, but you can't suppress the generation of the conscious content. So this also counters the idea that one conscious thought can lead to another conscious thought. In a sense, one conscious thought does not know of its relevance to ongoing action, to higher order goals, or to other contents in the field. So although consciousness is not epiphenomenal or omnipresent, as in panpsychism, its role is very passive and less teleological and purposeful than that of other accounts. Consciousness has very few moving parts. It is passive. It has no memory of its own. It depends on memory systems that are external to it that furnish it with outputs. It has no reasoning of its own, and it has no symbol manipulation properties. It is just a passive format for these action systems to be able to respond to the field collectively. So the key thing about conscious action is you're responding to one token, the McGurk effect, in light of another token, you smell smoke. Now, it does this same kind of thing for various different kinds of processes, so it looks like consciousness does more than it does, and it looks a lot more flexible than it does. But actually, the same collection of conscious contents will always give you the same action selection. So if conscious options, if the fields for action, if the action options in the field are X, Y, and Z, you'll always do Z. So it's actually a highly determined system. So, the contents of the conscious field wholly and exclusively determine voluntary action selection, and the system cares about right now what's going on. During action selection, the field functions as a unitary entity in terms of its influence over the skeletal motor output system. This point is important because it renders moot the debate whether consciousness should be thought of as a componential entity or as a unitary entity. For the action systems, it doesn't matter. They're sampling the whole thing, and it could be componential or unitary. It's treated as one thing. So the action-related modules in the skeletal motor output system must treat, in terms of functional consequences, the mosaic of contents in the field as one thing at one moment in time. So I will always in that dream say, where's the cucumber? During action, this is interesting. So in action control and ideomotor theory, it's very important for anticipated action effects, how it will look when I put the coffee to my mouth, and actual action effects, putting the coffee to my mouth. It's very important for them to be in the same format, because then I can detect a mismatch and know whether I failed to enact the action. But also important, not only must the format of the anticipated action effect and the actual action effect be in the same style of format, so must all information in the current environment. So you're grabbing the coffee and then a fly goes in the coffee and you veto action. So the fly, the intended action goal, and the actual action have to be in the same decision space. They have to be comparable tokens in this special format. So although consciousness has historically been associated with the highest levels of processing, here it's revealed that it's actually associated with very low levels of processing, and that level of processing is married to representations in the external environment. For example, olfaction. So you could be in an airplane thinking about whether or not to reject the paper you're reading for a journal, and then you smell too much airplane fuel and you decide to move somewhere else. The airplane fuel smell and your deliberations about the paper, at some level, the action selection system is scanning them all at the same time, and they have to be comparable tokens in the same decision space. Last minute changes in a course of action can arise from the entry of new contents. The fly enters the coffee. So consciousness, always people think, oh, consciousness is about the future, it's about the past. No, it's about right now. A given medley of conscious contents will always generate the same voluntary action. So although the approach is based in part on established ideas from diverse fields of study, it is a novel synthesis that advances understanding the role of conscious states in nervous function. It attempts to redefine the nature of consciousness. One can propose that if the heart can be conceptualized as a pump and the kidney can be conceptualized as a filter, then consciousness could be conceptualized as a frame composed of tokens, the color blue, an urge, a smell, that are in a common format, a format that can be sampled only by the action systems of the skeletal motor output system. The active generation of contents is unconscious, and the response to conscious contents is unconscious. Consciousness is passive, but necessary. Without it, action is not integrated, and you only have one efferent stimulus response stream guiding behavior. So the mechanisms generating conscious contents are themselves unconscious, so are the mechanisms responding to the other contents, which are devoted systems. If you lose a content generator and you cannot perceive orange anymore, no other content generator can supplant it. It's gone. So this is unidirectional communication. What's interesting about the approach is, even if the field is componential or unitary, you get the same conclusions. And the hard problem of consciousness is the same from this approach, whether the tokens are different in kind or in quantity. That is, if you have, if the action option is fruit A versus fruit B, and you have the hard problem of consciousness, how the neurons generate this conscious state, the problem still survives if it's just quantitative differences between the tokens. So if the field is a mosaic of quantitative entities, the hard problem of consciousness remains. So that may be interesting for progress on this problem, because we do know that the brain generates quantitative codes. So the distinction, all that matters is that a smell be different from a color and be different from an urge. So as an interface of sorts for the action systems, the conscious field permits for the response to one token to be framed by the contents, the other contents composing the field at that time. So the whole point of consciousness is I am acting to X. My action selection to X is done in light of Y, with motor control being unconscious and the generation of the conscious contents being unconscious. So it's a very peculiar form of processing. The physical basis associated with this frame is most likely unlike anything else we currently understand. Thank you.